Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Eduyot. We are up to Perek Chet Mishna Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilun Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai, Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov, Chana bat Miriam, Sason ben Rayin, Yoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen, and Le'avdil ben Chaim lechaim, and the Refuah Shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, Betoch Shah Chole Israel, and the Achlama Merav Binyamin Od Zion Chai ben Dvorah. The Torah forbids a Kohen to marry certain women, such as a divorcee. If a Kohen does marry a woman who is forbidden to him and he has a male child from her, the child is a halal who is disqualified from the Keunah. Although the halal's father is a Kohen, the halal is not subject to any of the laws applicable to Kohanim. For example, he is unfit to do the temple service and he is allowed to marry a divorcee. In most respects, he is like an ordinary non-Kohen. The son of a halal is also a halal. If a halal cohabits with a woman, he makes her unfit to marry a Kohen. These laws apply in cases of doubt as well. For example, if a Kohen marries a woman who might be a divorcee, the husband of this woman had given her a questionable divorce, and then he had died. If the divorce was valid, she is a divorcee whom a Kohen may not marry. If the divorce was invalid, she is a widow whom a Kohen is permitted to marry. Their son is a possible halal in this case. A woman who cohabits with a possible halal becomes forbidden to Kohanim out of doubt. This Mishnah refers to a family that includes a possible halal, but it is not known which member of the family he is. Therefore, every man in that family is suspected of being a possible halal. Such a family is called a mixed family because it contains a mixture of different categories of people. Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteral almanat isashi kshera lekeuna. Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteral testified about the widow of a mixed family, a widow who had been married to a member of a family that included a possible halal. The word isa literally means dough. Just as a dough is a mixture of different ingredients that cannot be identified in the dough, so is the family a mixture of different categories of people who cannot be identified. They said that she is permitted to marry into the keunah, although there is a chance that her dead husband was the possible halal of the family, which would make her forbidden to the keunah. She is in fact permitted to marry a Kohen. This is because two doubts are involved here. A, it is unknown whether her husband was the possible halal, and B, even if he was, it is unknown whether he was truly a halal. The general rule in cases of a double doubt such as this is that we rule leniently. The widow is therefore allowed to marry into the keunah. These Tanaim give another testimony about such a family. Sha'isa kshera, they also testified that a mixed family, a family that includes a possible halal whose identity is unknown, is proper, meaning although a possible halal is part of the family, it should still conduct itself like any other family of proper lineage. Which means that before a woman marries into the family, it must look into her background to find out whether she is forbidden or permitted, whether it ought to distance her, prevent her from marrying into the family, or bring her near, let her marry into the family. A family of good lineage, whose women are assumed to be fit to marry Kohanim, is required to investigate the backgrounds of women who want to marry into the family so that it keeps its pure status. Even if it is a family of Israelim, they must make sure that all the women of the family are fit to enter the keunah. Therefore, before a woman marries into the family, they check whether she is one of the women who are forbidden to Kohanim, such as a divorcee, a halala, or a zonah. In the case of our Mishnah, however, it could have been thought that since the family includes a possible halal, they have lost their status as a family of good lineage, and so they do not need to reject women who are unfit for the keunah. The Mishnah teaches that this is not true. Rather, they must still investigate women and ban them from entering their family when necessary. The next Tana disagrees with the first ruling of Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteral, where they permitted a widow of a mixed family to marry a Kohen. Amar Rabban Gamliel, we're going to skip the parentheses, because the correct version of the Mishnah is Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel said to Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteral, Kibalnu edutchem, we accept your testimony. We believe that this is what you heard from the sages of the earlier generation. Aval ma na'aseh shekazar Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai shelo le'oshiv batei dinin al kach. But what can we do about it now that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai has decreed not to let courts meet for this purpose? Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai prohibited courts to allow a widow of a mixed family to marry into the keunah. HaKohanim shomim lachem lerachek. Furthermore, the reality is that even if a court would rule about such a widow, the Kohanim would listen to the court only to distance themselves from her, meaning if the court would rule that she is forbidden, they would accept the court's ruling, avalol likarev, but they would not listen to the court to bring themselves close to her, meaning if the court would rule that she is permitted, they would disregard the court's ruling. To elevate the sanctity of the keunah, the Kohanim refused to marry a widow from a mixed family. Once the Kohanim accepted this restriction upon themselves, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai recognized it as a valid practice and decreed that no court should rule that such a woman is permitted to them. And the Rav writes, "Psak halacha, what's the halacha? Shalmanat isa asura lenaseh lekuna lechatchila, that this widow of a mixed family, lechatchila, ideally should not marry into the family of Kohanim, to a Kohen. V'im niset lo tetzeh, but if she did get married, we do not make them separate." And that is the end of Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Daled records 3 testimonies, the first of which concerns a particular species of grasshoppers. Heid Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer ish tzerada al ayal kamtzad dachan. Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer, leader of Tzerada, testified about the ayal grasshopper that it is kosher, meaning it is permitted to be eaten. This species of grasshopper is called ayal, literally male deer, because it looks like a miniature version of that animal. The word kamtza is Aramaic for a grasshopper, and dachan is the Aramaic equivalent of ta'o, pure. The ayal has most of the features of the 4 species of grasshoppers that are permitted by the Torah, listed in Vayikra chapter 11, verses 21 and 22, except that it has a long head, whereas the permitted species have round heads. Some sages derive from these verses that this one difference is enough to make the ayal forbidden, but other sages interpreted the verses as permitting the ayal. Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer testified that the second view is correct. The second testimony concerns the tumah status of certain liquids, val mashke bet mitbechaya, and he testified about the liquids of the butchering place. The slaughtered offerings were skinned and cut up. The parts to be cooked were washed in an area in the northern part of the temple courtyard, between the outer altar and the northern wall, as it says in Midot chapter 3, Mishnah 5. So he testified about the liquids of the butchering place in the temple, such as the blood of the offering slaughtered there and the water they used to rinse their flesh. The inun dachyan, that they are tahol, meaning they cannot become tameh. This is because liquids become tameh only under rabbinic law, and the rabbis do not impose this restriction on the temple, where it could lead to the disqualification of sacred things. Liquids cannot become tameh according to biblical law, but the sages decree that they can. Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer testified that the blood and water of the temple butchering place are excluded from this rabbinic decree. The purpose of this leniency was to decrease tumah in the temple courtyard, so that sacrificial items would not be disqualified by becoming tameh. A different approach the Rav offers is, even according to biblical law, liquids can become tameh. However, they cannot transmit tumah to other things. The rabbis decree that they can even transmit tumah, but they did not apply this stringency in the temple. The third testimony is also about tumah, udikrav b'mita mista'av, and he testified that one who definitely touched a corpse in a public domain is tameh. The purpose of this testimony is to imply that if there is a doubt whether someone touched a corpse in a public domain, he is tahor. In fact, it is a biblical law that when a doubt regarding tumah arises in a public domain, it is treated leniently, and the object in question is assumed to have remained tahor. However, the sages ruled that this law should not be taught to the public because they were afraid that it would lead to people being careless with tumah. Therefore, if someone would ask a rabbi what he should do in such a situation, the rabbi would tell him to purify the item by immersing it in a mikveh. Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer testified that a sage may rule leniently and tell the person that the item is completely tahor and there is no need to purify it. Although Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer mentioned only a corpse, his lenient ruling certainly applies where someone might have touched a dead sheretz or any other source of tumah besides a corpse in a public domain, since a dead sheretz has a lesser degree of tumah than a corpse. The sages were not pleased with Rabbi Yossi ben Yoezer's lenient rulings. They karu leh Yossi Sharia. However, they called him Yossi the permissive one because he permitted 3 things that were previously forbidden. Based on this Mishnah, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, page 37a, states that if any court permits 3 things that were previously forbidden, it is called a permissive court. And that is the Nabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.